So today we're going to talk about how pop culture has influenced fashion and has brought global changing trends. So before we dive into what is pop culture, we have to understand what culture actually is. So we all talk about my culture, their culture, your culture, but what is culture actually? Culture is something that one isn't born with. It is cultivated, absorbed, and reproduced. And it is what stylizes our lives. So, coming to pop culture, the name itself explains it. It is the popular culture around our world which is socially acceptable and followed in majority. It is commercial, dominant, relevant, and it emerges from the people itself. Now, talking about the history of popular culture, it has been around since the dawn of time. The fine arts of the greats Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Van Gogh, who brought a wave of artists during the Renaissance period, which is considered a massive culture. The culture of creating art as a means of expression. But all of this is just a general ideation of popular culture. What it actually refers to in the modern West is the cultural products that got popular through music, arts, dance, films, and television. So, to stick to our topic at hand on how pop culture has influence on fashion and global trends, we have to track back to the 1920s when it all first started. The era known as the Roaring Twenties, the era of the jazz music. The disheartening effects of the First World War brought a series of artists, writers, and musicians who expressed doubts and cynicism in their own artistic endeavor. Thus, the jazz culture was born. The technological advancements like the phonograph enabled the artists to record their composition and sell their records. But before that, jazz could only be heard in nightclubs or just live performances. But with the advancement, they could listen on the radio or even purchase their favorite recordings to listen at their homes. So with this, the consumerism on CD and record vinyls came into being, and this forever changed on how music was consumed. So now, fast forward to the 1960s. The decade that changed music and art forever. The decade which is considered one of the most creative periods in modern man's history. Love and rock and roll was the way of life. It was a major contrast to the 50s as it was a bright and colorful decade which was a way to cope with the frustration the public was feeling towards the politics and the US government. It was mostly counterculture. But it wasn't just fun. It is also the decade of civil war, protests, ongoing Cold War, and a great social unrest. But in the midst of all this, people found the escape in music and films. So how did the culture of the 60s shape the fashion industry? The 60s fashion was a break from the contemporary conservative society of the early decades. It brought a style of colorful apparels, short dresses, and skirts. It was mostly a decade for explosion of trends for women. One such prominent figure in the 60s were the Beatles. They played a great role in bringing global changing trends. The black and white double-breasted suits that they used to wear in their performances, the bright psychedelic bohemian paisley shirts, suits, and trousers, floral printed apparels, and the Indian-influenced shirts. And this brought a wave of psychedelic bohemian fashion around the world as we know of today. Until this date, we can see it being fashioned in many different ways. So now that we talked about the history and how the pop culture came to be, let's speed run through the most popular pop cultures that happened ever since the 60s. Let's talk about the 80s, the time of the neon lights and the synthwave music. Even though the 60s paved the way for future pop cultures, 80s was a decade which revolutionized pop culture due to its trends and style. This decade brought a huge change in our lives with its technologies, the way of lifestyle, films, music, and fashion. 80s was a great time for movies and music. The good old MTV was launched in 1981, which paved the way for the music videos that we enjoy today. And for what stands out is the fashion during the 80s. It was both horrible and trendy that changed how people characterized themselves. The designers from the 80s didn't fear on experimenting. The 80s saw a wave of never-ending trends on adornment. It brought large amounts of hairdos, headgears, eyewears, and footwear. The 80s marks most of the trend that we follow today. From the high-waisted jeans to the baseball jackets to the faded haircuts. And it is safe to say that most pop culture starts trickling down from the 80s because it brought most of the famous music genres from pop to rock to metal. This brought a whole new wave of music genres that we still follow today and inspired by. Why does music play a great role in fashion? Well, because it's a muse. People like to follow their idols. So these musicians also influence on how trends work. We like to wear what we listen. We want to associate to the music that we listen. So this is the general idea of how media influences fashion. And for media to become influential, it should be popular. And this is what pop culture following actually is. When something gets too popular, majority of the population would follow, and this will lead to a global trend. And this is how pop culture influences our lifestyle and fashion.